and welcome to today's episode of Daily Debrief, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and let's get into our first story. Now, finally, Russia has made a move on the Ukrainian chessboard, a symbolic move of recognizing Donetsk and Lugansk region, two breakaway parts of the Donbas region. Putin has said that they are going to consider any attack on this region as the one they will combat militaristically. Now, the recognition of the breakaway republics, which form an enclave held by Russia-backed rebels since 2014, has triggered a condemnation by the Western powers and a promise of targeted sanctions from the United States and the European Union, with a broader package of economic punishment to come in the event of invasion. Russia will now deploy troops with the support of separatist officials, and Ukraine will either have to accept the loss of a huge chunk of territory or face an armed conflict against its vastly powerful neighbor. To know more about this, let's get in Prabir Purkayastha. Prabir, if you could tell us, what does it mean for the future of Ukraine, this particular statement by Putin?
Well, I think you have correctly characterized it as a symbolic act, because this part has been under the protection of Russia from 2014 onwards. The Western powers who have condemned the Russian intervention, or promise, as yet it's a promise, they have been claiming that Russia has already militarily been there. They have been supporting it with their forces, and their irregulars or regular Russian troops are there in these two regions. So given that, for them to suddenly claim that something is completely new has occurred itself is a problem, because this is something which they have claimed was the normalcy in that region. The question is, if you take why this intervention has occurred in the form it has, it is that these two breakaway provinces, or the two breakaway parts of the provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk, because 2/3 of the Donetsk, Lugansk and the Donbas region are still as a part of Ukraine. So it's only 1/3 roughly, which is the breakaway parts that we are talking about. So if we look at this part, that there was a promise after the 2015 Minsk II agreements that the Donbas region would have a certain degree of regional autonomy, and there would be languages, which is Russian language, be acceptable to the people or the Ukrainian government as a language, a semi-official language in Ukraine itself. Because originally Ukraine had a two-language formula. If you look at the linguistic and ethnic history of Ukraine as a country, and of course Putin has raised certain questions on that itself, but there were at least more than 50 to possibly 55-60% of the speakers had their first language as Russian. It was the lingua franca for large parts of Ukraine, and ethnic Russians, those who think of themselves as Russians, were probably about at least 35%, primarily in the region that we are talking about, but also between Donbas and Kiev also, there was a significant Russian population, including in Kiev. Now, Russian language is sought to be now wiped out from the schools, in the education system, from newspapers, because newspapers have been closed, which are Russian newspapers, and television stations are closed down, which are primarily catering to the Russian language speakers, as well as a certain kind of politics, which Russian speakers seem to have. They don't like the way Ukrainian government was going, and also the fact that there is a strong Nazi street force which is on the ground, which has been extremely anti-Russian. So this is what is the Azov battalion, which has Nazi symbols on its uniforms, which has valorized Stefan Bandera, who worked with the German Nazi formations in the attack on Jews in Ukraine, and of course fought against the Russians, the Bolsheviks at the time. So all that history is a glorification of a certain kind of white supremacy. Don't forget, they also massacred a huge number of Jews in Ukraine. These are the same forces. So the fact that West has cozied up to them in order to prop up a government or a set of governments which want much more closer relationship with the European Union and NATO, and is very strongly anti-Russian, spills into this reality of an ethnic battle as well. And if that happens, which is what was happening, then of course Russia has a stake because they're Russians and therefore their protection is going to come from Russia. The important point here is the Minsk Accords now are dead. We've been talking in our show that Minsk Accords should be revived. This is what was called the Normandy format discussions. But it was also very clear that Kiev, Ukrainian government, was not interested in the Minsk Accords or the Minsk Accord 2 as it is, the second version was in 2015, and primarily because they're afraid of the street power of the Nazi groups, or the pro-right-wing white supremacist groups, and who had promised if Zelensky gives any kind of autonomy to the Donbas region, we're going to drag him down. And that is the threat. The street power of these formations is what really prevented any resolution internally of the Ukrainian problem with the Russian minority or a very strong part of Ukrainian population itself. So given that Russia finally saw that there is no possibility of this government, Zelensky government, being willing to do anything to restore autonomy to the region and give at least the status of Russian speakers, which is official, of protecting their identity. And this is the response he has made. Don't forget, 3 days back, Zelensky in Munich asked for, sanctions against Russia because it might invade. Okay, so it was like a precog kind of thing, that you have not committed the crime, but you should be punished because you are going to commit a crime. So now Russia's response has been, okay, if that's going to be the Ukrainian government's position, any settlement of the question does not seem to be there. So he has broken the status quo in this way. What is the response of the Donbas government? What is the response of the Ukrainian government going to be? Are they going to attack this breakaway provinces, which is now under Russian protection and probably Russian military presence? Or are they going to come to a discussion? Will this be resolved? It doesn't depend on Russia alone, as the European powers and the Americans want to say. It depends a lot on what the Ukrainian government is going to do, and that depends on the internal relationship within Ukraine itself, which at the moment does not seem to be conducive to peace.
Okay.
So I don't think we're going to see an invasion by Russia. I think what we are likely to see is a heating up of this Donbas situation and maybe localized clashes over there. And the big question in front of Russia, what do they do about 2/3 of the Donbas region, which is held by the Ukrainian government, and which is basically also ethnically and in terms of Russian speakers, probably majority. So what are they going to do about this? And the Ukrainian government question is, what are they going to do with the Donbas region? Now it's officially under Russian protection. Let's face it, it has been under Russian protection for quite some time.
Prabir, in fact, Russia is already facing sanctions from US and the European Union. What are the nature of these sanctions? How serious are they?
So if we take the fresh set of sanctions, which have been announced just now, after Russia's declaration saying that we have given recognition to these two breakaway provinces as independent nations, and we will give it our military protection. That's basically what Putin has said. I think the sanctions again are symbolic. Okay. Just as what Russian steps were symbolic, they've said entities operating in this region will be sanctioned. Okay, so any entities centered in Donbas, in these two breakaway provinces, they can be sanctioned. Will they sanction rest of Russian entities? Doesn't look so at the moment. Again, all of this is open because there are pressures building upon United States internally and on the European Union externally that more sanctions should be imposed in Russia, because the Americans would like to hit the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and that's the gas supply which is not started. They would like to hit all gas supplies from Russia to Western Europe, because if they do that, the gas prices go up. The fracking gas, which bulk of it is now produced by the United States, is actually, it needs a price of something like $70 to $80 as a floor in order to be viable. And it was not when it is $60, it's not viable. So if the gas prices go up, and they will go up if Russian gas stops going to Europe, which is much cheaper in terms of supply. Yes. If it is LNG, it is exported from other places, exported from Russia to European Union, the price needs to be at least about $80 for Americans, the United States, to make a profit. So they are quite interested in shooting down Russian gas coming to European Union anyway. So this will be a golden opportunity for them to turn the screws on the European Union and say, you're not sanctioning Russia more. And that's the pressure which they have been putting for a long time, saying Nord Stream 2 needs to be killed. The second pipeline connecting Germany to Russia needs to be killed. So this might be an opportunity for them to do that. So we will see how it goes. Let's not forget, when NATO was set up, the head of NATO at that point of time had said the purpose of NATO is to keep Germany down, the United States in Europe, and to get Russia out. So that is also the name of this game that we are seeing.
Moving on to our next story, Palestinians will have an entity in the future, but not a full-fledged state. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz told the Munich Security Conference on Sunday. Gantz, who heads the centrist Blue and White Party, has strongly advocated for negotiations with Palestinians who seek to establish a sovereign state in the occupied Palestinian territories based on the pre-1967 borders. Now, to know more about this, let's go over to Prashant. Prashant, if you could tell us, what does this mean, the word entity that is being used when the Palestinians have been asking for a statehood?
Right. So, Swastika, first thing I'd probably dispute the fact that Blue and White is what is called a centrist party. Right now, it's arguable whether there are any centrist parties in Israel. All of them are various shades of the right. And even Benny Gantz's so-called inclination for negotiations is to be very much contested. You're probably comparing him to other more rabid right-wingers who were saying there will be no negotiations at all. If you remember, Benny Gantz is Israel's defense minister, former leader of the army, closely involved in a lot of atrocities on the Palestinians. So it would be wrong to see him as any kind of dove in any sense of the term. But the notion of entity here is kind of important because I think it marks a shift in how a lot of the Israeli political spectrum is seeing the situation over the past few decades. We do know, for instance, the Oslo Accords that were signed in the early 90s, the idea of the two-state solution was put forward, which was that there would be a Palestinian state. And this Palestinian state was supposed to have, its borders were supposed to be the pre-1967 territories before the 1967 war. Palestinian state would soon have sovereignty over the West Bank, Gaza, etc., all these regions. And over the years, we have seen that concept slowly moving towards its almost inevitable death as the Israeli political spectrum has moved far more to the right. Israel's occupation policies, its apartheid policies, like Amnesty and many others have pointed out, have intensified. It is sought to break up Palestinian society in multiple ways in terms of geography, in terms of policies, in terms of the atrocities it's been conducting on the people. Yeah. It has blockaded Gaza, as we know, one of the most inhuman acts of this century. So it's not surprising that a substantial chunk of the Israeli political spectrum now does not even want to talk about a Palestinian state. So when they talk about an entity, what it means is some kind of an autonomous Palestine, some kind of a vague autonomous Palestinian existence, which is obviously short of a state, which also means that Israel does not have to engage with Palestinians, Palestine, like it would have to engage with any other state in the international scenario, which basically means that Israel gets a blank check to continue its current policies of occupation, of all various kinds of atrocities. And we see this in every aspect of day-to-day life in Palestine. So when we talk about entity, this is really what it means in this context, in the sense that there's been this increasing emphasis, especially from the time Donald Trump came to power, of this notion that what has to be done is to achieve some kind of equilibrium based on the current situation, which is that the Palestinians have limited rights. There is some kind of focus on the economic development of Palestinians, which means that they'll get money from some of the Arab countries which are their neighbors. Maybe the United States will help with some more humanitarian aid, etc., etc. They'll focus somehow on building some amount of economic capacity for the Palestinians, but they will be less focused on the rights and the rights of the Palestinians. So that is really the larger philosophy which which underlies this notion of an entity, which underlies the notion of these kind of talks. And it's important because also to note, because of the fact that Benny Gantz has often been accused by other sections of the Israeli right wing, like Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party, of being dove, so to speak. So he's also taken this opportunity to sort of push back against those accusations, which are, according to in Israel, they count as accusations, being for peace. So that's really the larger context. Basically, it means that the status quo of occupation, Israel, what it now means is that large sections of the Israeli political spectrum want to continue the status quo of this occupation, because any any attempt at discussing the earlier understanding that was there of a pre-1967 Palestine basically means that Israel will have to withdraw in various ways.
Yes.
And no Israeli politician, no part of the Israeli political spectrum wants to commit to that. So that's really what we are talking about right now, in the sense that while it's being disguised in this word that's an entity, what we're actually really seeing is that this is a reiteration of its current occupation policies. It is a reiteration of its current brutal apartheid policies.
And also, what about the timing of this entire statement? Why was this needed?
Right. So a couple of factors. One, like I said, of course, the fact that this is in some ways a response to the criticisms leveled against Benny Gantz, that he's as not as right wing or as hawkish as as he's what do you call, as people claim. So he's trying to push back, saying, hey, I am as right wing as you, or I am as patriotic as you, or whatever. Two, it's interesting that it was delivered alongside representatives of the Emirates and Bahrain, which are two partners of Israel in the Abraham Accords. So we do know that the Abraham Accords were signed towards the end of the Trump administration. United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, later Morocco, Sudan also became part of it. And this was this whole attempt at normalizing relations with Arab countries. And these Arab countries are important because the Arab world for long had been at least the leaders of the Arab world, at least to satisfy their own populations, or at least not to anger their own populations, had for long taken the position of being pro-Palestine, right? And this was an important source of strength for the Palestinian movements. Over the past couple of decades, I think this stance is diluted. The Palestinians are aware of it. In these Arab countries, the spirit on the ground is still very much pro-Palestine, but the leaderships, the various governments, many of them the monarchies of the Gulf, for instance, have drifted much further away and towards the American camp, towards the idea of accommodation with Israel. So it's interesting that it was delivered at the same platform where an Emirati and a Bahraini representative were also present. So one of Israel's attempts in recent times has also been to sort of build bridges with the political leaderships of these Gulf countries, which is minus the Palestinian cause, so to speak. So building those kind of relationships with the Palestinian cause does not figure in it at all. And this is an attempt to actually, in some ways, isolate the Palestinian cause. On the one hand, exactly, that's one hand. On the other hand, it is also an attempt, I think, to sort of deflect the massive international criticism that is coming in its way, because I think globally over the years, on the ground, among people, ordinary people across the world, among people of conscience across the world, there's been an increasing revulsion towards the policies of the Israeli administration, towards the policies of various successive Israeli governments. Like I said, this is not based on politics or anything. All Israeli governments in recent times have followed the same set of principles. So there's been an increasing revulsion towards that. And Israel, I think, has increasingly come to understand that in order to deflect from this criticism, in order to deflect from this general anger against it, they're trying to sort of build these kind of political alliances with the elites, the political elites of various countries, and that way establishing relationships with the political elites of these Arab countries is important, because you can always say that, hey, we have good relations with this Arab country or that Arab country, so we're not against the Arab people, or we're not against the Muslims, although we might suppress the Palestinians. We're not against, so that's also, I think, a way of how Israel's diplomacy has evolved, and that is probably one of the underlying factors behind the Abraham Accords as well. The fact that Israel is in some way seeking to postpone what I think is inevitable, that as time passes, there will be a global reckoning that Israel faces in terms of having many of its atrocities questioned. We saw that the Amnesty report came recently.
Yes.
Again, long overdue, but this is building on a long tradition of such condemnations. It's a big question whether the UN Human Rights Council is going to come up with a similar set of accusations and claims as well. So it's in this context, I think, that the timing is important.
Thank you, Prashant, for telling us all of those details. Well, that's all the time we have on our bulletin today. Do come back to us tomorrow. Keep following us on People's Dispatch. Thank you.